Probably two of the most influential Christian thinkers in the history of the Western Church are Augustine and Calvin. And when it comes to the doctrine of the atonement, they can't both be right. At first glimpse, it looks like they're both on the same page, but as we do a quick deep dive here, I think we'll realize there's some really key differences that call for us to exercise discernment and precision in our theology. As we find ourselves in John chapter 19 and 20, this is by way of a meditation on the death and resurrection of Jesus. Augustine proposed an atonement theology called Substitutionary Atonement, and this means that he saw Jesus as dying not only with us, but for us. His vicarious life and death and resurrection is for us. And he would see that the wrath of God, or the judgment and the condemnation of God, are directed towards sin and Satan and evil and death and the powers of darkness. And because we are under those powers, Jesus had to enter into our lives under those powers. And in his death, all that was against us was condemned. And when he was raised again, we too can then enter into that vicarious life that he has gifted to us. So there's the very real sense that Jesus died not only with us but for us. One of the favourite motifs of Augustine was that we are sick and we need a healer. And so Jesus comes and he too receives the ailments, the sickness that we had. He receives, in fact, that sickness even takes him to death. But he is raised up in new power and in new healing and in victory. And so in his overcoming the sickness, he then invites us in to receive that liberty as well, and to receive that healing. So that whole motif of sickness and healing, that was strong in Augustine's mind. Now to Calvin. Many would say that he proposes a very similar, some would say almost identical doctrine of the atonement. But I think there are some absolutely key differences here that we need to pay attention to. Calvin took Augustinian theology, I think, and cranked it up a few notches. And he would propose something called Penal Substitutionary Atonement, meaning there's a penalty involved. And here is where the very critical maneuver comes in for Calvin. Under Augustine, the wrath of God is directed against sin and evil and death and hell and Satan. Under Calvin, that's moved, that is shifted, and God's judgment and God's condemnation and wrath are now no longer against those things primarily, but they're actually directed primarily towards the sins and the sinners. So individual sinners are now the object of God's wrath. Not death and sin, but sinners. Okay, this is a key distinction, because now God is angry, as it were, at the whole human race, and so the work of Jesus is now to come in as a substitute and to pay the penalty. So that's where that name, Penal Substitutionary Atonement, is the penalty that's paid by the substitute to provide atonement. But the penalty is punishment. There's retribution. So the punishment that should have been upon individuals for our sinfulness is now upon Jesus, even in his righteousness. So for me, that is a critical junction, because it requires us to ask, was God directing his wrath against sin and evil and darkness? Or was God directing his wrath against sinners, and Jesus put himself in the way of that to protect us? Well, I can go along with Augustine's theology. Calvin's, I have a much harder time associating with. Another consequence that goes along with Calvin's maneuver is now that since God's wrath is directed against individual sinners for their sinfulness, it is now up to individual sinners to then be brought into the atonement, to by faith be included in the atonement, which means that the atonement is only effective for those people who choose to be in God. Which brings him to his conclusion that the atonement is limited to the elect, which would be the real church. And everybody else, well, their sins were not paid for on the cross. It was only limited to the elect, those who have chosen, and God has chosen, to be in Christ. So we then have to do some pretty serious gymnastics with some key texts. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. There are many, many places that we have to really try and buckle our minds around this theology of limited atonement to make sense of Calvin's theology in light of the wrath of God now being directed towards human beings and not primarily against the powers of darkness and evil and sin itself. So that might sound like it's getting really sort of picky and technical, but I think at the heart of that conversation is a crucial vision of God. Is God wanting to pour out his judgment against the things that are against us, death and evil and sin, or is God wanting to pour out his judgment against us because we've participated in sin and evil and death? I think it is that God is against the things that are against us. That's the whole point of the atonement. That's the whole point of forgiveness and love and grace and reconciliation. It is the sweeping back into the life of God that Jesus has provided for us. He's enabled for us to, by faith, receive this beautiful gift and to be transformed by it. Not because God was angry with us and took it out on Jesus, but because God's wrath was against the things that were ruining and wrecking us, and Jesus stepped in to participate in those and bury them so that we might go in freedom. Okay, a lot to think about. We'll continue on in this part of the conversation next week, and until then, take care. Peace.